Howdy, YouTube neighbors. This is the episode that had to happen. You can't be a Monster Train YouTuber unless you make or participate in a tier list at some point. So, here's the Mutators tier list. Keep in mind that this is simply my take on the matter, and I'm simply ranking them for the amount of fun and variety they add to a standard run of Monster Train in the context of running 3 Mutators. S rank means the Mutator changes gameplay in a major way, and that major way has to be fun to play. A rank means the Mutator is going to change the run in a way that is usually fun, challenging, or interesting. B rank Mutators usually change the run in a way that's fun, or this is just kind of the catch-all rank for above average Mutators. C ranks are where we're going to put Mutators that don't impact the run in any real significant way, and then the lowest rank, D, is reserved for Mutators that always make the run less fun when they show up. It's fairly simple, so let's get started. First up is a new challenger. It randomly replaces your champion with one that's not from your main or secondary clan, and it's not going to be one of the ones from Wormkin. I'm going to start off by putting this in B tier because, well, it's not fun to get Shardtail Queen in a situation where you can't get imps. Oftentimes I find myself just throwing away the champion when I have this Mutator because it doesn't really sync up with the cards you're going to see in the run. But sometimes you do get to run Primordium unshackled from Umbra, so it's a mixed bag here. Next up is a simple plan. I'm going to put this in A tier. Sketches of Salvation is fun. +2 unit cost is challenging and all but forces you to play with the sketches, but some clan combinations just really aren't set up to make proper use of sketches, particularly those like Awoken and Umbra that really care where their unit is in the order in the train. Likewise, you have to find answers to haste conduits early in the game, or you're going to have a bad time you can't do anything to prevent. Nonetheless, I'm always happy to play with this Mutator. It's a fun, good time. A rank. Acid Rain is next. It does 2 damage to all units at the end of combat. It makes the early game really challenging, and then it's pretty much ignored in the late game. It is beneficial for guaranteeing kills on imps and tombs and Votivari and all that. It makes permadeath a whole lot scarier and makes bleeding money more annoying. In general, it can be fun, but it's not always fun. I'm going to put it B tier. Arcane Allergy. Arcane Allergy gives all enemies spell weakness 1. I'm going to put it in the A tier, and this is in no particular order. I don't consider this more or less fun than, a simple plan. We're not going to worry about that level of detail in this tier list. Why I like it in A tier is it turns weak starting spells into occasionally really solid damage spells, and it can make some late game bombs just straight nuclear. The impact on the game is purely positive, but it does feel bad if you get nothing but imp and drag starters when the Mutator's active. So, nonetheless, I'm gonna give it a firm A. Arduous Arcana. It makes spells cost 1 more, and you'll definitely recognize it if you've played the expert challenges. So, as weird as this is going to be, I put it in A tier. Yes, it's all downside, but it makes magic shops and boss ember relics much more valuable, and so it adds a strategic element to the game that you're not going to have without the Mutator. When 0 cost spells become 1, and then 3 cost spells become 4 when you're on the opposite ends of that particular spectrum, you have to be a lot more careful about your deck crafting. So I found that to be a fun challenge, and I'm happy to put it in A. Armchair General. Gives your champion a bunch of sap and heartless. Oh, not you. This is C tier. Because some champions just ignore it, like Titan Channel Soul Guard. Some champions just don't care, like Tethys. And in general, the impact to the overall game isn't really felt. There's going to be some cases where you might have wanted to play like Burn Bright Rector on the bottom floor, and you can't do that now, so that limits your options somewhat, but for your average, and for, honestly, the majority of Monster Train runs with this mutator, you're not really going to feel the impact of it in any major way. So that's the very definition of what we were calling the C tier, so that's where it goes. At your service is next. You start with Advanced Prototype, but you have 2 more Train Stewards. This is an S tier for me. Why? It allows you to get very aggressive in the early game as you find your lines. It lets you run just wild with Firelight Fade. It encourages some very wacky transfusions into those Train Stewards, or you can pursue something less traditional and, probably more fun. It's a good balance of positives and negatives with a very high ceiling for potential. So, S tier. I'm happy with that. Big Chungus. Big Chungus is next, and while its name is no less than A tier, in application it's B tier for me. It makes all units one size bigger, so space on the floor becomes super limited. Forget about monstrous penumbra entirely. So it provides an interesting challenge without being overly crippling, but it does limit the number of lines you can pursue. What it encourages, however, is overstacking of floors, which is a somewhat rare occurrence when you get to Covenant 25, and that's always a fun, good time, so it's got that going for it. So, B tier. Now for our first D tier, Bleeding Cash. Every time a unit gets hit, you lose 1 gold. The effect on the game is honestly minimal outside of an aesthetically very displeasing effect of giving you gold balances outside of multiples of 5. But when it comes to this mutator, you either have damage shields and damage spells or you don't. It simply adds a level of difficulty to the game that you can't honestly counter with strategy, so there's nothing really much else to say about it. We'll call it D tier. Brawl. Brawl's an interesting one. Brawl gives plus 5 attack, plus 10 health to all units in the game, yours and Heaven's, and plus 10 to the Pyre. This is a net negative, because there's a lot more enemy units than there are friendly units. So, nonetheless, this is a solid A tier for me. You have to invest in your pings if you want to make them effective against backliners with plus 10 health, and collectors become a lot harder to get. But it's not all downside. Brawl is a godsend to glass cannons like Dante, Animus of Will, Horned Warrior, so it's definitely more challenge than benefit, but the balance between the two is that it strikes. That's what makes Brawl fun for me, so A tier. Alright, Broken Valve is next, and that's going to be another A tier. So if Volatile Gauge worked like its Slay the Spire counterpart, and it set cost from 0 to 3 instead of 1 to 3, it would be S tier for me, easy. But it doesn't, so it isn't. In particular, it makes Soulguard and Rector just very painful to play. Outside of that, Volatile Gauge is more fun to start with than it is to see and run, because you can plan from the start how you're going to make use of the rules that Gauge warps. The extra draw frees you up to take space on boss relics, which enables more varied strategies. I wish it was S. That's the hard thing here. I wish it was S, but it's not. It's A, and I'll leave it in A. I'll be fine with that. Burn Bright, plus 2 Ember Return. That is a B tier mutator. So, plus 2 Ember with no downsides makes runs easier. Like I said, no downside. And it gives you cause to take more expensive spells and units than you otherwise would. Heck, it solves half the problem of Shadow Siege. So I've found that Burn Bright goes best when you pair it with negative mutators like Junked Up to lessen the effects. It functions as a lowerer of difficulty, but it doesn't really do much more than that. Alright, Buying Power is next. It lets you duplicate cards at merchant shops. So, And this may also come as a surprise, but I'm gonna put it C tier. There's a reason for that. The impact of its existence on a run is surprisingly minimal. In fact, I've had multiple runs with it where I just had no cost to duplicate cards beyond my usual Helvins. That being said, there's no downside to it, and it does open up the possibility to go absolutely wild with certain high rolls, but that just screams win more to me. It doesn't really change how the game plays or feels, so I'm going to relegate it to the mostly ignored tier. Alright, Cheap Trick is the flip side of Arduous Arcana, and it makes spells cost one less. I put it B tier. It's got no downside. It enables remove, consume, and double stack in cases where you would never consider it, and it makes incant even easier than it already is. But other than that, it's honestly got minimal impact on a run. In general, if you're playing the game right, you're playing most, if not all, of your spells already by the time you hit rings 5, 6, so on. So Cheap Trick really just functions as a reducer of difficulty, not unlike Burn Bright. I think they're good neighbors here in B tier. Okay, Come Prepared. Come Prepared. What it does is it adds 12 random cards from your 2 clans into your starting deck, and I've got a very hard time placing this one. An argument could be made for any tier, honestly, depending entirely on what 12 cards you get, and that's the problem. So I'm going to put it in D tier. The reason I put it in D tier is it makes RNG a very large element of your run, bloating your deck from the start so large that you're not actually going to get to see all of your cards in the Ring 1 battle and probably even the Ring 2 battle. It practically requires you to find removals at every reasonable opportunity, forcing you onto whatever paths the vortices are. The most damning thing of all is that it completely upends what makes Monster Train fun, in my opinion. In Come Prepared runs, you're not building a deck based on what the run offers, you're building the run based on what your deck offers. To me, that's not Monster Train. Okay, I'm sorry. Old man ranting done. Let's move on. Crystal Ball is next. You get Cheater's Hand. That's it. Not much to say here. Cheater's Hand is good in about 98.6% of runs, and it enables you to do strange things like hold back your champion until the opportune time to play him. You basically get to treat cards as though, they had permafrost. It somewhat cheapens draw relics, like, Sap Tap and whatnot, because whatever you put back, you're just going to draw back anyway. Meh. I'm just going to put it B tier. There's not much to say about Free Cheater's Hand. Oh boy, hot take time. Dante's Comedy. You start with Dante. Nice and simple. A hot take, C tier. What? C tier? But it's Dante! Exactly, that's why it's C tier. Dante is unarguably a very powerful unit. There's a reason that high score runs featured on the community pages run Dante's Comedy all the time. But here's the thing. When you start with Dante, you play a Dante run. Every time it's a Dante run. It's the same problem with Come Prepared. As soon as... No, okay, I don't know if that's fair or not, but... No, I made the metaphor, I'm going to go with it. Instead of building a deck around the run, you build the deck around Dante. Okay? The runs just look the same over time. Now, granted, when you combine it with other mutators, like the Associated Expert Challenge does, you can make fun situations, but considered in itself, it's just Monster Train Dante Edition. It's fun the first time, maybe first couple times, but after that, you're playing the same game over and over. And it's Groundhog's Day Dante Edition. Okay, alright. I'm happy to get to another S tier, because we've now hit Duality. Duality is absolutely insane, and it's equal parts benefit and detriment. It doubles all status effects. Now, status effects are basically anything that's not a trigger. It means that Animus of Will now hits 5 times instead of 3. Welder Helper drops 40 armor when he shows up. However, it goes both ways. It turns armor trials, especially early game ones, into unwinnable propositions, Same with Spike Trials. It doubles the Ember Drain you take when you play a unit on the top floor, and it turns stealth bosses, especially Crystal Cloak, it turns them into certifiable nightmares. It's very easy to get drunk on power when you're running Duality, and then just forget all of a sudden that you're at Ragefell with 100 shards and he's hitting you 7 times. It's an unarguable S-tier mutator. Enough said, let's move on to early lead. You get to start with Lost Luggage and Improved Firebox. So basically, the strongest opening hand you can get within the confines of the game's RNG. It's B tier. It's B tier. So why is it B tier? It's okay on its own. It makes the run easier, but it's honestly best paired with mutators that limit your card draw or your discard capability. And so it forces you into making tactical decisions about your hand from turn 1. Alright, Extra Pyre is next. It's plus 80 Pyre health. Easy C tier. Easy. It allows you to play a little bit more aggressively in the early game, but in 19 out of 20 runs, you're just not going to notice the impact of it. So I'll put it in C tier and just leave it there. Okay, Fallen Champion. Fallen Champion is a simple but elegant mutator. You don't get your champion. I'm going to put it A tier. The expert challenges, I think, do a really good job showcasing how well it works with other mutators. True champion, truer champion, no problem. I think that's all of them. But even without Dante, Hef, the Limbo banners, the mutator does stand well on its own. It forces you to play very cautiously in the early rings before you get your units and your lines set up. Like a normal Tethys run, most of the time, actually. Okay, maybe that argument alone is enough for B tier. Nah. I think I'm sticking with my decision. I think we're going to keep it in A. A tier. A tier. Done. Fast Draw gives all units quick. For me, solid B. It's got a big upside, and it makes champions with action abilities like Dire Channel Soul Guard, you remember him? and Imperialist Queen, more interesting because they get to do their thing before the enemy attacks now. That being said, there are still times you don't want quick. It eliminates spikes as an option, it eliminates revenge triggers as an option, and there's definitely other reasons you wouldn't want to have quick. So it's not all upside, just mostly upside. You're playing mostly the same run of Monster Train with this mutator, so B tier. Final Shard. If you've seen the expert challenges, you know this one. It's featured in 2 of them. So it gives your Pyre Damage Shield 2 and Fragile. So basically, you get 2 shots on the Pyre, and then at 3rd shot, it's game over. This one's hard to rank. It goes B tier for me. It goes B tier. So there's definitely fun to be had by building a strategy to ensure that nobody's getting by you to hit the Pyre, and it makes for some really tense, stomach-clenching moments. But here's the problem I have with it. It greatly limits the number of viable lines of play that exist. I think, actually, when you consider the 2 expert challenges it's in, I think that provides a really good guideline as to how Final Shard should be approached when you craft a mutator run that has it in it. And in general, it warps the run such that you're building the run around it, but not in a particularly novel, fun, or interesting way. So I think B tier is right where it belongs. Alright, front-loaded. Okay, this is a weird one. -3 Ember per turn, you start with 20 Ember, and you get to carry Ember over every round. So you basically, you get your allowance, turn 1, 20 Ember, and that's all you get to spend that fight. Until, eventually you do end up with Ember Relics if you're playing the mutator right. Well, if you're playing the mutator smartly. I don't want to say right. So, this mutator is S for me. So why is it S? It introduces a completely new and fresh way of approaching the run. It's the exact same game, but a fundamental rule about that game's been changed, and you've got to adjust your game and your strategy accordingly. Will you play aggressively with the cards you draw in the early game since you have the Ember to play them all, or will you save your Ember for the right moments? What's the value of those Magic Shop -1s now? Maybe you want to swing Magic Shop now instead of Steel Shop for your valuable spells that you want to play frequently. What's the value of Ember Relics now? So, in the end, I have yet to have a bad time playing with this Mutator, regardless of what other Mutators accompany it. With one exception, I might discuss that. I might discuss that later if I have time for another old man rant, but I feel confident that this is an S relic. Just like I feel confident that Google Eyes is a C tier relic. This is going to be fast. It literally does nothing. Well, nothing except sometimes give me a mild sense of nausea watching the eyes bounce up and down. Okay, let's move on. It's not worth wasting time on. Gravity is up next. Okay. So at the end of every round, all your friendly units descend to floor. This is a solid A for me. The downsides of this are obvious, but this can lead to some absolutely absurd overstacked bottom floors. It lets you play more units than you ordinarily would, and you have to make tactical decisions on which floor they're going to begin on, because you're going to want, if you're going to overstack the bottom floor, you're going to essentially want to curate which units are in front of which other units, but you're not necessarily going to draw your units in the order that you want to see them, so you have to place them on levels that will allow them to descend at the rate where you want them to finally land. It's a fun time. It's a good time, and that's why it's A. It's honestly, it's really close to S for me. But when I compare it to the 3 Mutators I have it up there already, I just don't think it's in the same league. So we're gonna stick with A. If I didn't have OCD, I wouldn't care about the ordering here, but I do, so I do. All right. Hashtag blessed. This one gives you a random artifact at the end of every battle. It's a B for me. It's a B for me. There's no downside, and it can make for some interesting mid-game pivots when you high-roll artifacts from your Mutator. But in general, it just makes a run easier. Now, I do like it as a balancing piece for negative Mutators like -1 card slots. Like yeah, your cards are worse, but here's some artifacts to compensate. That makes it a little bit more fun, but standing on its own, I think it's a B tier Mutator, and I'm sticking with that. Heavy. All right, Heavy. Heavy adds 5 deadweights to your deck for a grand total of 7 at Covenant 25. It's going to be another B tier for me. So this one's all downside, but there's really no means of incorporating it into the strategy of your run. You could replace it with draw 1 less card per turn and see very little difference. I've seen it frequently in the high scores runs on the community page paired with Dante's Comedy. So it obviously has its niche cases, but for the most part it just exists to make the run a little harder, less consistent, and nothing more. So I think it's at home in the B tier. Hero's Burden. This is an interesting one. So Hero's Burden gives you 15 shards at the end of every fight. So, doing the quick math, if you take no other shards on the run, which is extremely unlikely, then you're going to roll up on Seraph with 105 shards and then 130 for Divinity. This means that a standard run with this modifier, taking the shards that you would probably ordinarily take in the course of a run as you build your deck, you're going to end up with over 200 shards at Seraph, and even 300 to 400 is certainly possible. It's A tier for me. It's A tier for me because it gives a sense of impending dread over the course of the run when it's involved. No matter how fast you scale, and no matter how good, how strong you feel about your deck, the game's difficulty just keeps escalating behind you. So it's a solid A in that it's always fun to play, but it's not quite the reality warping that the S tiers up here do to a run. So I feel very confident putting that in A. Highly reactive. Okay. Uh, highly reactive doubles up all your triggered abilities. Incant, Inspire, Harvest, Gorge, Rejuvenate, Slay, Strike. I'm probably missing a bunch, but it's all upside. Got no downsides, but I think it's more fun than B tier because it opens up lines and champions that otherwise really wouldn't be viable, like Reaper Prince and like Glutton Penumbra. So I think it's a good solid A tier pick. All right, so now we have come to my favorite mutator in the game, Hive Mind. Hive Mind makes your units all unit types. It goes right here, S tier. The downsides are extremely minimal. Morsels now trigger Arcus's Rally Shards, which is an unpleasant surprise the first time you see it. And that's really it. I suppose Imperialist Queen will kill all your units if you put them on the same floor as her. She might even kill herself, now that I think about it. I've never tried that. Okay, I've got a new project. I got to see if she'll kill herself with Hive Mind. That's just funny. Okay. So, what it does do, and why I put it in S tier, is it makes certain cards and artifacts just extremely wacky. Advanced Prototype, for example, now gives all of your units multi-strike and damage shield 2, which is great on its own, but you give that to Superfood Primordium, and you've got a bona fide merchant of death on your train. So, Gurg's Goad sees every unit as a demon. Wing Technology sees nothing but morsels. Hardened Hull thinks everything's an egg. Mask of Penumbra and Queen's Tail, they trigger every time you play a unit the first turn. Doesn't matter what unit it is. Encased Ember, it gives you 5 Ember anytime a unit of yours dies. And then there's perhaps the most insane one of them all, Shroud Mitosis. Shroud Mitosis looks for a morsel. It sees morsels everywhere, so it just straight up copies a unit 3 times, including your champion. It doesn't even consume. You can hold it over. You can fill your train up with just copy after copy of units. So, it definitely warps the game so hard that it's practically unrecognizable the moment you see any of these abusive cards and artifacts. And it takes a feature that I find very underutilized in the unmutated game in unit types, and it brings a spotlight under it, and I never dislike that. The only reason I hesitate to put it in S is because it's pretty much literally all upside. Once you find one of those abusive mutators, then the run just becomes easy, but it's easy, but it's a hell of a lot of fun. And yeah, you don't want to do Hive Mind runs all day every day, but man, they are fun when you put them down. All right, let's move on. I could talk about Hive Mind all day, and I'm sure you don't want to listen to it, and I don't want this video to be 3 hours long. In fact, I'm trying to keep it to an hour if at all possible. That's gonna be a hard sell to make happen, but let's take a deep breath and let's press on. We got Hollow. Hollow gives all friendly units Heartless. Woo. C tier. You're going to be unlikely to notice it unless you're playing a specific archetype of Awoken or you're planning to use Lifesteal in some way. It might have been more interesting if it were all units, meaning that enemy units with Recover got nerfed, but it's just friendly units, and honestly, the effect is quite minimal. You're unlikely to even notice it. If I had a hammer, it gives you Hef, it gives you intrinsic Hef, and it gives you good old Wingmaker. I'm going to put it A tier. So why am I going to put it A tier when I just relegated Dante to C? Well, the difference is Hef is a lot more difficult to play. She's a larger size, has a higher cost, and she's just a less impressive unit overall. Now, her infusion does give a rare trample ability, and I love my trample sweepers. So that opens up new lines of attack, and her base ability, when you pair it with Wingmaker, it makes floor space a very strategic resource in the run. So it's got no downside, but it's rather interesting in itself, and it's best coupled with modifiers like Fallen Champion. And you're going to see a lot more different types of Hef runs than you're going to see types of Dante runs. So that's why Hef is A and Dante C. Speaking of Dante, here's Junked Up. Junked Up adds 8 Calcified Ember to your deck, and I'm going to put it A tier. The reason for that is it saddles you with a burden that you're going to lessen over time, but you really need to pick the best time and place. Unless, of course, you luck into a Sinner Salve, in which case it becomes useless. But let's consider that a fringe case. Most of the time when you find Sinner Salve, it's probably going to be later run where artifacts are more abundant. So let's discount the Sinner Salve case and just consider Junked Up on its own. So you got to pick the best time, best place, and best opportunity. So when can you spend 3 mana to get rid of it? Because you got to do it 8 times. And you're going to likely need to do most of it in the early game when clogging up your deck is most harmful to you. But I mentioned Dante earlier because if it's not obvious, it turns Dante's comedy into a very interesting mutator combination. So these 8 Calcified Ember are making him more powerful, gives him more multi-strike, but at what cost? The cost of your deck's consistency. So the question then becomes, how many of them are you going to cut? To what degree are you going to sacrifice your deck's consistency for Dante's power? So, in that context, it works very well with other mutators, but I think it works well enough on its own. It's an interesting enough challenge that I believe it belongs in the A tier. Okay, Levity. Levity gives all units haste. Oh, gives all enemy units haste, excuse me. You can't really give haste to friendly units. And it's a purely negative modifier. It's all downside. So it's gonna be strange when I stick it here in S tier. So, why is this an S tier? Why is this so fun? Giving all enemies haste means you have 1 less turn to prepare, meaning that you'll likely need to consider pyre healing and protection resources in addition to your run crafting. And you're going to have a plan to deal with Stealth 2 units, or they're just going to walk right past you and hit your pyre really hard. But there is a very interesting side effect of this negative modifier that changes the scope of the game, and that's why it's in S tier. In most rings, and basically, by most rings I mean any ring that doesn't have a floating boss on it, it essentially turns the middle floor into a safe space. And that safe space you can put units you'd otherwise never consider. Units like Wildwood Custodian, Cuddle Hex, and Emberforge. It's a safe space to stash Dark-Calling Rector. So, in summary, in this essay I will describe why Levity is an S-tier modifier. So Levity is a challenging modifier, but it changes the scope of the game in a way that makes it a really fun challenge. And I consider that the definition of an S-ring mutator. So that's where we're gonna stick it. So life insurance is next, huh? Okay, life insurance, it's a weird one. You start with rationing scales. You start with memorial fund and Golden Vault. Golden Vault's rationing scales memorial fund. All right. So for all intents and purposes, your pyre health is 50 at the start of every combat. But when the pyre gets hit, you lose money instead of pyre health, which is a weird combination. But to compensate for this loss, you get 5 gold whenever one of your units dies. On a typical run, you'll barely notice the difference. So it should go in C tier. But on a difficult run, you're going to find yourself broke and unable to recover. And that makes it D tier. But if you're running Imps and Tombs or Eggs, you're depending on endless units, you can generate a lot of cash pretty quickly. Given that you be flush with cash, you can pretty much ignore the occasional leak to the pyre. And that would put it in A tier. So, taking all of this into consideration, I think we're just going to call it a B tier mutator and move on with our life. So that's what I'm going to do. So let's move on. Luxury and Limbo. Luxury and Limbo gives you a banner of both your clans on Ring 1. It's all upside, and it makes the early game that much easier. And that being said, it's going to C tier. Why? Well, outside of the Expert Challenge, no champion, no problem, which, by the way, is a great way to master rare units and get the Divinity Crown for some really difficult clan combinations if you get sick of Dante. Outside of that, it doesn't really change the scope of the run at all. It's easier, but it's the exact same run of Monster Train. You just get to start with 2 free banner units. Now, it shines brighter when paired with Fallen Champion, but even then, I think having Hef or Dante instead makes for a much more interesting run. So, I've made my case. It's C tier. Okay, Magic Hand. That's another odd one. So, with Magic Hand, cards aren't discarded at the end of your turn. This effectively gives all your cards permafrost, and on one hand, that sounds like all upside, right? But until you've got enough Ember to play all of your cards, you're going to get stuck with high-cost cards and dead weights in your hand, which means your total draw power is introduced. It's a very interesting premise, but it's not really game warping. So I think it's fair to call it an A-tier mutator. So it's worth noting here that Stygian's got tools in their disposal with Force to discard that deals with it and lessens the impact. But outside that, it's a strategic element that you've got a plan to deal with, but that you can also utilize to your advantage. That's very solid game design to me. So I'm happy to give it A. All right, Mansion. Mansion gives you an additional 2 space to every floor. It's a B to me. It's a B. So let me explain. It opens up the possibility of playing large units alongside others where you ordinarily couldn't, but it's hardly game warping. There is a world somewhere in the multiverse where you could have both Mansion and Burn Bright and have Shadow Siege instead of your champion. That would rock, but sadly, that world ain't this one. Until that happens, Mansion gets a B from me. Moneybags. Moneybags doubles all your gold earned, and it also goes to B tier for me. It's all upside, but it does empower you to reroll shops when you otherwise wouldn't. It lets you pay for removals earlier and more frequently, and it lets you make liberal use of trinket shops. So it does open up lines of play that are unavailable in the base game, so it's not completely uninteresting. I've honestly found that it pairs best with One Track Mind down here. So when One Track Mind is going to force you onto a random path, but if you have money bags, you're actually in a position to utilize the shops that are on the path. So in that context, I find it a lot more fun, but on its own, it's okay, it's good, it's B tier. Okay, we've reached another one of my favorite mutators, Moth Magic, or as I've come to call it, Torch Jetpack Squad. This is a very easy S tier for me because this mutator is a hell of a lot of fun. It turns all of your damage cards into Ascend cards. That lets you overstack floors, particularly the top floor, and it lets you do really wacky things with Sketches of Salvation, and it turns your damage spells into means of breaking apart enemy configurations on the train. So, it's not all upside, though. Because if you hit an enemy on the top floor with a damage spell, they're going right to the Pyre Rune. So, if you do that, you had better come correct and you better be ready. So, it's a wonderfully insane balance of upside and downside, which makes it absolutely perfect for the S tier. What is this? Oh, Multipyre, okay. Multipyre does exactly what it says. Gives your Pyre multi-strike. So this is another one that's in a weird game space because it either doesn't affect your run in any way or it comes in clutch. I'm going to give it a B tier because it's something you can build around, but most of the time it's just not notable in any way. Let's move on. Musical chairs. Okay, well, musical chairs, at the end of combat, it randomly shuffles the position of all the units on your train. That means backliners can't hide behind tanks. and that goes both ways. It's almost an S for me, if I'm being honest, just because of how it warps the fundamentals assumptions of the game, but I'm going to put it A, and here's why. It cuts off more lines of play than it enables. You know, certain lines like, you know, having a large solo unit on a floor, or something like Double Keeper of Echoes, and of course, we just mentioned Sketches of Salvation, really don't much care about the order of the units, and they can ignore the modifier completely. Whereas, units that are obviously designed to be tanks or glass cannons are just simply too risky to play. Hellhorned Awoken combination with this modifier just sounds like pure hell. I've never tried it. I probably should at some point. So, given these factors, an argument could be made to put it B tier, but I'm going to stick with A. I think I'm going to stick with A. Alright, my true form. It wins the award for the best icon, confirming that Taco Bell still exists in hell. However, its fun ranking is going to be somewhat lower, I think. It increases the health and damage of your champion by 50%. So this makes certain specific champions really good. Monstrous Penumbra, Burn Bright Rector, and Titan Channel Soul Guard. These guys become absolute beaters. Cultivating Sentient becomes nigh unkillable. But here's the problem. Outside of those specific champions, you generally don't care much about your champion's stats. It's the abilities that are important on your champion. Sure, champions become more survivable, which is nice, but in the end, the Mutator really doesn't change what you're doing in the run at all. It just makes those 4 specific champions much better at doing what you are already going to do with them in the first place. So, for that reason, I'm going to put it B tier. Never Say Die is next. It gives all your units endless, and this may be a surprise, but this is S tier for me. So, let me explain. At first glance, it really seems like nothing but upside. All your units are endless. Let me phrase that another way. All your units never go away. Are you sure you want to drop that train steward down? You're just going to draw him again next round. How about those 4 imps in your hand you wanted to drop and forget about? Well, now you're playing Oops All Imps. Reform lines just aren't happening because no one ever dies. When you remove a fundamental rule of the game, you change the game at a foundational level, and that's what this Mutator does. It requires you to approach the game with all new strategies to compensate. So, to me, that's why it's a good time whenever this Mutator is in play, and as such, I'm going to call it S tier. Alright, Ninja Training is next. Another really cool icon. It gives minor bosses 5 rounds of stealth. I have a hard time deciding between A and B for this one. Now, it adds a new element to deal with, but by the time the boss hits the top floor, there's only 3 rounds of stealth to deal with. Assuming you didn't drop units in their way to eat those rounds. Now, it makes Crystal Cloak harder, but you're not always going to see Crystal Cloak, and other than that, the impact to the run is honestly rather minimal. Nonetheless, it is something you have to consider and strategize for, so it doesn't belong in C. So, final answer, we're going to call it B tier. Next up is No Fluff. No Fluff gives all cards 1 less upgrade slot. All downside, obviously, but I'm putting it in A tier. The reason for this is because it makes your selections at shops much more important. You don't get the benefit of a -1 when double stacking a spell or when removing Consume from it. You have to pick whether you want an attack buff or a health buff for your units. You don't get both. Capricious Reflection becomes a major commitment. It makes the run more challenging, but it does so in a fun way. And on that note, I'm going to skip ahead a bit, actually, so I don't repeat myself later. And where are you? I am going to put Zoom Enhance here at the very end here in A tier right next to it. Because it's the inverse of No Fluff, giving all cards an extra upgrade slot. So, by contrast, Capricious Reflection now has a lot of its downside reduced. Double stacking and removing Consume from a spell becomes a real possibility, and you can make use of some of those modifiers in the Steel Shop, like the +5, +10 that never get picked. But here's the thing. You can't fill all those slots every run, so the decision to go Whether to go to Steel Shop or Magic Shop becomes more important on every ring, like it does with No Fluff. So, they're both A-rank mutators. Okay, what's next? What is this? Oh, One Track Mind. This mutator locks you into a specific path, so you don't get to choose which side of the ring you're on. This is a hard one to evaluate for me. My first inclination is to drop it in D tier, because when you remove that choice, I don't really feel like you're playing Monster Train. However, it cannot be argued that the scope of the game isn't changed significantly, and the choices you make along the way become more complex. Whenever you pick a unit, for example, you accept that you may never see a relevant Steel Shop, and so you've got to pick your units accordingly. Same with spells and magic shops. You can't count on dupes or removals, so you need to weigh how badly you need removals at each shop. It warps the game way too much to go into B tier, but it doesn't make sense in S or A given the mutators that are already there. So, for lack of any better place to put it, I'm just going to drop it in B tier. Pain Train. Another cool looking icon, I will admit. Pain Train wins the award for coolest name, for sure. No, I'm going to take that back. Pain Train is a contender for the award for coolest name, but it's a C tier mutator. Get in the back of the bus, Pain Train. There we go. So, let's be honest. By the time you're playing in Covenant 25, Spikes 1 ain't a huge deal. Yes, it does absolutely shred damage shields, and you need to invest in health for your sweepers and your glass cannons. But on whole, the degree of difficulty the mutator adds to the run is quite minimal. You know what's not minimal, though? Permadeath. Instant S tier. No argument. None. For much the same reason Never Say Die is up here, actually. Permadeath is say nothing but die. So, it's free purges of your train stewards in the early game, and if you've rolled both imps and dregs for your starters, you're going to find yourself very quickly without a deck. So, the early game picks become monumental for your run. You've got to be very careful with the units you do want to keep around, and you're forced to make critical timing decisions as to when those units go onto the train. It also facilitates some really wacky decisions. For example, have you ever slotted Endless into a Horned Warrior? I have, and permadeath is why. S-rank mutator, no argument, fundamentally changes the rules of the game in a way that is fun and challenging. Alright, we're in the back third now. We are running a bit late. I don't think we're going to make an hour, but we can get close, I think. Okay, who are you? Protect the Pyre. Okay. Plus 40 health, plus 15 damage, plus 15 armor for the Pyre. It's okay. It allows you to play more aggressively, especially in the early game, but it's not going to fundamentally change the way you play Monster Train. I think it's a nice, safe, boring B tier. Puny Things. Okay, Puny Things. All units are size 1. It's all upside, but you can do some truly wacky things with it. You ever put down 5 Keepers of Echoes on the same floor? How about a holdover Glimmer Steel Singer squad? Now, these are French cases to be sure, but freeing up so much space on the train gives the player a lot of space to really explore bizarre lines that would never work in an unmutated game. So, I think I am going to put it in A tier as I take a drink of water. I think that's quite fair. Return on investment. Okay, so in the 5 rings where collectors show up, you get a second collector that fight. Doing some quick math, if you hit all 5, that's an extra 600 gold that run. 50 plus 50 twice. 150. Yeah, 600 gold. So if you've got to run without pings in the early game, though, that's twice the collectors you're now likely missing and twice the feel bad. This mutator is just a lot of meh to me, and especially when compared to money bags, doesn't really feel like it reduces a game warping amount of gold into the economy. So I'll drop it in C tier and move on. Sacrificial is next, and oh man, this one's weird. It makes the first unit that's dropped every turn fragile. It's super hard to evaluate this because you're either in a clan combo that completely cuts off where it completely cuts off most of your lines of attack. I'll bring up Hellhorn and Awoken for yet another example. Or you're in a combo that has plenty of stealth and day, so you can mostly ignore it. Or maybe you're running Imps and Tombs and really like to see it. I don't know if this is fair, but I'm going to stick it in D tier. It just, to me, it just feels like bad game design and places way too much emphasis on your clan combination over what you see in the run. Now, I think it would be fine in an expert challenge where it's surprisingly absent, but for a typical run of Mutated Monster Train, it's not adding anything that I would consider fun. Okay, I think I've convinced myself. We can leave it in D tier. Seeing double. Here's another one that's hard to evaluate because it's all upside and it's a powerful upside. First unit you drop each turn gets copied. Now, strangely enough, and I was just talking about it, it's an interesting mutator to pair with Sacrificial because you get the copy, but they're fragile. So that's an interesting combination I'm going to have to explore at some point. Where was I? Copying, yes. Double champions, for example, that's always a powerful thing. I'd love to see double Primordium, but it's not that easy. Those copies take up space. And if you want to abuse this powerful mutator, you've got to plan accordingly. So I think it's a natural fit for the A tier. And that's where I'm putting it. And I think Shardless is a natural fit for the D tier. I have racked my brain trying to come up with a reason for this mutator's existence. It doesn't let you fight Divinity. It increases the difficulty of the base game without giving you the tools to fight back. And overall, it just makes the game feel like a slog. I've tried it with different combinations of mutators several times and been nothing but frustrated every time. Here's the way I see it. If you want to play the base game, play the base game. You want a harder base game, play the base game with mutators. The only justifiable reason I've come up with for this mutator is for those who want to feel like they're playing the base game with Wormkin. It's okay, I guess. Maybe that's even interesting enough to make an episode of Mutator Madness about it later, after swearing I was never coming back to Shardless again, but that's such a fringe case. I got no problem putting this in D tier. Shields up. Alright, all enemies have damage shield 1. So this is probably going to come as another surprise. This is an A tier mutator for me. Now, let's be clear. It's not something I want to see often. It's all downside, and it's a particularly challenging downside. It's like that one Malika challenge, but all day, every day. But it changes the rules of engagement on the train in a very fun and interesting way. For example, do you put that plus 10 piercing in your glimmer or your vent in order to bypass the shields? Or do you keep them non-piercing in order to wipe off the damage shields? Do you try to play 2 floors to ensure you have enough hits available to break all these damage shields and stem the tide of leaks? It's a new problem to solve, and the game gives you many possible ways to solve it, so I'm going to consider it perfect for the usually a good time tier. Oh, Slow and Steady is up next. I love this mutator because its icon reminds me of the turtle from the Logo Rider program that I learned way back in elementary school in the halcyon days of the mid-'80s where Logo was the pinnacle programming language for graphic design. If you know what FD50 RT90 Repeat 3 does, then you might be a Gen Xer, or you might have been an IT specialist or programmer today that really studied. Okay, old man rambling done. Alright, Slow and Steady. It gives your units plus 10 damage, but 7 sap. So, you start out with minus 4 attack. After 2 rounds, you come back even, so by the time enemies hit you in the top floor, and then you steadily grow the next 5. Based purely on its very cute icon, I really wish I could put it higher, but it's C tier. It's C tier. You stop noticing it's even a thing around when the time Train Stewards cease to be relevant, so basically Ring 3, unless you're having a really bad run. And even then, it's just a minor nuisance. I've played it several times and have never once changed my strategy for a run based on having it there, and honestly, I don't think many people will. So it goes to the tier of negligible effect. Oh boy, here we go. So, you know what's not fun in a card game? Not playing cards. Small Hands goes into D tier, despite its innuendo-licious name, Small Hands. Yes, you can make the argument that drawing only 3 cards a turn changes the scope of the game in a way that high-cost cards become more valuable and you have to draft a lot more carefully, but in reality, what happens is that you suffer for 3 rings until you take draw twice and then just play a less fun version of the unmutated game, as anyone who has beaten that wretched Spellcraft Expert Challenge can attest, myself included, twice. So, D tier. Shot through the heart! Okay, nope, I'm not going to be singing Bon Jovi today, not happening. I don't know why I even started. Spell Piercer. Spell Piercer does exactly what you think it does. It gives all your spells piercing. That's a solid B tier for me. So, it's like 95% upside. You get to ignore spell shields completely, but now you don't have the benefit of using your spells to knock off damage shields. It's not relevant often, but it's super relevant when it is. Now, it does give you the opportunity to pursue some spell damage lines that you ordinarily wouldn't because spell shield waves exist on Divinity, but otherwise it's just a fun little added bonus to a normal run. And you know what? I think that fits B tier to a T. Starry Suffering fits C tier to a C. Friendly units get days too. So, quick show of hands. Who is not playing the top floor except in special circumstances like Scourge Waves? Anybody? I'd raise them high. I want to make sure you're counted. Alright, that's what I thought. The effect of this mutator on the game is so minimal that the Arcane Focus Expert Challenge needed that wretched Tithe modifier to make it challenging, and we'll rant about that later. It's easily ignored, so easily goes to C tier. Alright, Strike Hard. Strike Hard gives everybody multi-strike 1. I'm sorry, did somebody say Superfood Primordium? No one said that? Well, I did. A tier. So what you need to understand is the part that I didn't emphasize. Strike Hard gives everybody multi-strike 1. Let me change the emphasis. Strike Hard gives everybody multi-strike 1. Bad guys, bosses, everybody. So, because there's more forces of heaven on the train than forces of hell, incoming damage is going to greatly exceed outgoing damage until you've scaled properly. And even then, it's still going to be a challenge defensively. It turns the early game into something really scary, resembling a stealth game as you're doing your best to sneak by under the radar until you're finally powerful enough to scorch the earth and salt the ground in your wake. So that's an easy A tier for me. Alright, we can see the ending now. The Elite. +5 health, armor, and attack to all your units. This would be an easy argument for C tier, but I'm going to put it in B tier. There's something sneaky about the Elite. It's got a hidden downside. You get this mutator, and somewhere point in the run, you start asking yourself, why can't I kill my Imps and Tombs? Why is Votavary still here? Well, they're beefy now. Units that you want to just drop and die just drop. They don't die sometimes. It's not much, but it's just interesting enough for me to ascend the Elite from C tier to B tier. Hey kids, want to do math? Yeah, me neither. That's why the math challenge goes in D tier. You want to turn off combat previews, just do it in the options menu. There's no reason for this mutator. There's even less reason for this mutator than there is the Shardless mutator. Yeah, it's a cute little trap for newbies attempting their first expert challenge, but beyond that, it does nothing. It adds nothing, it just slows the game down. As you're stopped to consider even the most trivial rounds of combat. Like some of the very bad D&D games I've been in my life. Okay, now I'm starting to understand why I hate this modifier so much. Let's move on. Tissue paper. Okay, tissue paper. Non-boss units become fragile when they hit the pyre room. There's not much to say about it, honestly. It's absolutely hilarious watching big beefy tanks get riggedy wrecked like they're stepping up to Saitama when they come to the pirate room. But if you get Vapor Funnel, well, GG. You no longer have to worry about waves. You can spend your, well, as long as you can survive the waves, you don't have to worry about killing them, and you can spend your entire focus prepping for Relentless. It's really funny, but I don't think it adds much to the experience. But nonetheless, I don't think I can put it any lower than B tier. Alright. It's time for Tithe. Let me clear my throat. Let me make sure I'm absolutely heard. Screw this mutator. I hate that it's in 2 separate expert challenges. You know what's not fun about a game based on making a bunch of choices to carve a path to victory? Letting RNG take the wheel and not making choices. So cutting your funds in half means not getting to re-roll shops. So you're stuck with whatever the RNG gods and the Church of the Holy 1 in 4 give you. But you know what? There's one reason I dislike Tithe even more as a mutator. It doesn't work as intended. Do you want to know how I beat both those expert challenges twice? I played Melting Remnant. Melting Remnant units and artifacts that generate gold completely bypass the Tithe mutator. Alright, that's enough said about Tithe. We got 6 left, let's bring it home. 2 for 1. Every time you get a card, you draft a card. Anytime you draft a card specifically, you get a second copy. You can get cards outside of drafts, and it doesn't copy them. This works for both units and spells. So, despite the fact that I say time and again 24 is the largest deck size I ever want to carry to Divinity, I actually really enjoy this mutator. I enjoy it enough I'm going to put it in A tier. Now, it's led me to some really wacky self-infusions and multiple floor setups because I have the surplus resources. And it makes spell draft choices more interesting because you need to consider your deck size and the removals you have available in your drafting decisions. Despite the fact that it goes against one of my fundamental tenets of strategy in roguelike deck builders, I have never not enjoyed having this mutator, so A tier. Upgraded drafts. Okay, well, let's consider this. Each card you draft comes with a slot pre-filled. So, on the whole, I don't like Capricious Reflection. I don't like things that take choices away from me in a game that's about making choices. Even so, this is A tier. And the reason it's A tier is because I'm going to put it next door to a very similar mutator, No Fluff. Consider upgraded drafts, no fluff with a side of jalapenos. You only get 1 slot, so your choices matter more, but instead of nothing, you get something. What's interesting about Capricious Reflection in this mutator is that it gives you random access to unit traits outside your clan combinations. I've encountered once a Titan Sentry with Burnout 1 in a Stygian Wormkin? Yeah, Stygian Wormkin run before with this mutator. Sometimes you get a free quick on your Shattered Shell. Sometimes you get a large stone on your Glugsider, rendering it even more unplayable. So, for much the same reason that No Fluff is A tier, so is upgraded drafts. Vampiric Touch gives all units, Lifesteal 3. This is more downside than upside because your units are going to burn through Lifesteal 3 pretty quickly, but the Forces of Heaven won't. It's the kind of mutator that doesn't really make a big impact until it makes a face-melting impact. It's something you definitely have to be mindful of, so it doesn't belong in C tier. But it doesn't make enough impact to hit A tier, so you know what? We'll call B tier its home. It's going to curl up with a blanket in B. Volatile Spells is another one that's really hard to evaluate. It doesn't belong in C tier, no way, because it's got a very heavy impact. What it does, for those unfamiliar, is spells that have a target now target randomly. It's all downside, because your pings now become very unreliable and your buffs almost never go on the unit you want. They usually go on an enemy unit. So that means you're incentivized to invest in units more than spells, and to draft spells that affect the entire floor. So the effect that has makes runs with this mutator kind of all look the same. Whether this type of challenge is fun is very subjective, and I've both had fun and not had fun with it, so I'll stick it in B tier too. Why not? We got 2 to go. We are almost done. Cure Light Wounds. Great name, mediocre mutator. All units restore 5 health after every combat. Ordinarily, I wouldn't hesitate to put this in C tier, but there's a subtle nuance here because it's a free rejuvenate trigger every round. I like anything that gives help to an underperforming game mechanic like rejuvenate, and it makes those pesky 10 life having backliners in the early game, especially in Ring 3, more irritating. It's close, but I think I'll put it in B, thereby saving us from a very aesthetically displeasing C tier with 1 mutator hanging out. A fairly shallow reason, I guess, but I think it's just interesting enough to be in B tier, just barely. Alright, we've made it to the end. Last but not least, Yeetpocalypse. Awesome name, award-winning name, mediocre mutator. So, when Yeetpocalypse is active, you have to purge a card after every battle. On paper, that sounds like a very exciting mutator. You're forced to alter your deck composition after every combat. How can that be anything less than A tier? Well, in practice, that's only 8 times a game. And how it usually plays out is that you treat them like free purges until your deck is stabilized, if it does, around ring 6 or 7. Otherwise, it's just free purges all the way around. And then, once you're stabilized, you just draft an extra card specifically to yeet, bypassing the mutator's downside. It's way too interesting to put in C, but I don't think it's interesting enough to go in A, so another butt on the B tier couch. And there you have it. All 73 of these bad boys ranked. In all, it looks like a very solid, even distribution amongst the mutators, and I think that's a good sign of overall game design. It goes a long way to show why I love mutators and monster trains so much. Far more than I did in Slay the Spire at any rate. So, I had a good time making it. I hope you had a good time watching. Agree, disagree, get at me in the comments. Keep it respectful, and I'd love a good dialogue. I'll include a link to the tier maker so you can craft your own easily if you desire. So, thank you for joining me, YouTube neighbors. I will see you next time.